Welcome to the Sankofa Pan-African series. We travel through history's corridors, illuminating Afrocentric narratives. Support us through Patreon or by buying me coffee. Your subscription is a great start, but do hit the bell for notifications so you know when we have new episodes. Share our videos and visit our website sankofastorybooks.com for stories, biographies, Afrocentric nursery rhymes, and other resources for children. Together can change the negative narratives about us.
Education in Africa has a rich and intricate history, shaped by indigenous traditions, ancient centers of learning, and the profound impact of external influences. From the preservation of oral traditions to the imposition of colonial systems and the challenges of modernity, African education reflects the continent's resilience, adaptability, and cultural richness. Let's explore this journey through time, with a detailed focus on the colonial era. Before formal schooling, African societies relied on indigenous education systems deeply rooted in oral traditions, hands-on training, and communal values. Elders taught children practical skills, spiritual beliefs, and cultural customs through storytelling, songs, and rituals. The Library of Alexandria in Egypt was one of the most famous libraries of antiquity, attracting scholars from across the Mediterranean and other parts of Africa. By the 14th century, Timbuktu had become a hub of Islamic scholarship. Universities like Sankore were renowned for their contributions to mathematics, astronomy, law, and medicine. Nubia and Ethiopia were early centers of Christian theological learning, producing ancient manuscripts and fostering literary traditions. Education in pre-colonial Africa was community-centered, using oral traditions, proverbs, and songs to pass down knowledge and values. These methods preserved history and cultivated moral and social responsibility. Islamic education was flourishing in North and West Africa as early as the 8th century, and Quranic schools provided religious instruction and literacy in Arabic. Similarly, Christian missionaries introduced reading and writing in regions with Christian influences. While practical education like farming, blacksmithing, weaving, and carpentry was passed down through apprenticeships. These skills were vital for the sustainability of African societies and their economic systems. The colonizers imposed Western-style schooling, but these systems were designed primarily to serve their interests rather than the educational needs of Africans. Colonial education policies varied by country and region, but were generally structured to sustain colonial domination. Key characteristics included segregation and inequality, and education systems were divided along racial and social lines. In settler countries in Eastern and Southern Africa, Europeans had access to well-funded, advanced schools, while African schools were poorly resourced and focused on basic literacy and manual skills. Education for Africans aimed only to produce a semi-skilled labor force to serve colonial economies. Africans were trained as clerks, teachers, and agricultural workers with little access to higher education. Colonial education also sought to erase African cultures and languages. Schools promoted European history, religion, and values, sidelining African heritage. Instruction was conducted in European languages, marginalizing indigenous languages and creating barriers to learning for many students. Although colonial powers implemented different educational policies, the results were similar. For instance, in British colonies, education was largely left to missionaries, leading to uneven access. British systems emphasized adapted education to train Africans for low-level jobs. French schools aimed to assimilate Africans into French culture, teaching them to adopt European ways of life. In Portuguese colonies, education was minimal and highly centralized, with a focus on indoctrination rather than skill development. In Belgian colonies, like Congo, education was almost entirely controlled by Catholic missions, emphasizing religious instruction over academic or vocational training. Despite oppressive systems, African communities resisted colonial education's limitations. Communities established independent schools that blended Western and traditional African knowledge. Many Africans retained their languages and traditions despite efforts to suppress them. While Islamic education predates European colonization in Africa, it became increasingly formalized in the colonial era. Quranic schools were significant for spreading literacy in Arabic and providing religious instruction. However, they were not without limitations. Quranic schools often focused narrowly on religious texts, neglecting subjects like mathematics, science, and history. Many Islamic schools excluded female students, perpetuating gender disparities in education. In some regions, Islamic education systems were co-opted by colonial powers to serve their agendas, leading to internal divisions within African Muslim communities. The colonial education system therefore left a lasting legacy of inequality. By independence, many African countries had extremely low literacy rates. The problems persisted because post-colonial education systems often relied on European frameworks, hindering the integration of African knowledge systems. Some governments invested in building schools, training teachers, and implementing policies for universal primary education. The economic stranglehold left by colonizers undermined most African countries' efforts to improve their educational systems. Many rural areas lacked schools and basic facilities. The rapid expansion of education systems outpaced the supply of trained teachers. Post-colonial curricula often remained Eurocentric, sidelining African history and knowledge. But there were a few achievements. Countries like Kenya and Ghana achieved significant increases in school enrollment. Institutions like Makerere University in Uganda and the University of Ibadan in Nigeria became leading centers of higher learning. Initiatives like Eneza Education in Kenya provide digital resources to students in remote areas. Widespread access to mobile phones should enable the use of educational apps and digital content. Governments and NGOs need to focus more on addressing barriers to education for marginalized groups, including girls, children with disabilities, and refugees. Partnerships with organizations like UNESCO and UNICEF need to be more supportive of literacy programs, teacher training, and infrastructure development. The history of African education highlights the resilience of its people in preserving and adapting their knowledge systems. Despite the challenges of colonization and systemic inequities, African societies must continue to innovate and reclaim their educational heritage. We must continue to learn from the wisdom of Timbuktu, strive to integrate modern technology. Africa's educational journey should reflect an enduring commitment to learning and progress.